In our previous lecture, we had talked about the society of the Rajputs. रिमाइंड कर सकते हैं क्या क्या डिस्कस किया था हमने, क्या कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स थे? बताओ. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, extremely rigid and hierarchical social structure based on the concepts of varna and caste, strictly regulated marriage and contact. There was widespread inequality. The society was dominated by Brahmin and Kshatriya alliance, right? The social status of Vaishyas had declined, while that of the Shudras had improved, primarily because of the economic changes that had taken place during the early medieval age, the ruralization and increasing agrarianization of the society, resulting in the Vaishyas occupying roughly the same position in the social hierarchy as the Shudras. They lived together or had the same professions, almost had the same legal and practical status also. Another basis of differentiation within the society was gender. The condition of women had degraded further. The society was a male dominated society and women were expected to be subordinated to men in all respects. They were denied education, inheritance, and had limited public role. That means they were kept in seclusion. Women had stopped having an individual identity independent of their male relatives. Their status within the society depended upon their male relatives directly. So they were, or the status of women was linked to male relations. In this context, the only reprieve was that Indian society respected women as mothers and mothers and wives. Primarily because of their reproductive role. This was a period where the demand for agricultural labor was increasing, therefore the productive role of women in the society was appreciated. But at the same time, women were also subjected to several evils and misconceptions. Misconceptions such as women, especially menstruating women, were considered impure. They were kept in a complete separation during their menstrual cycle. They were subjected to several evils also, such as child marriage, dowry, sati, johar, various religious and educational disabilities, widows were generally not allowed to remarry. However, the position of women was not so straightforward. There was a little bit of complexity as well. For example, scholars such as Vigyaneshwar in the Mitakshara and Jimutvahana in the Gaya Bhag gave women the right to own as well as inherit property. Further, at least in the case of some elite women, the tradition of Swayamvar was in vogue where women exercised complete freedom in their choice of husband. Further, we also have contemporary references in literature to learned and highly cultured women. ठीक है? Further, sorry. So, these positive aspects make the analysis of the condition of women quite complex, but in general it is accepted that the position of women had declined further as compared to the previous ages. One of the main institutions responsible for the declining condition of women was marriage. It was regulated through Varna, caste and Gotra. In the case of Varna and caste, the normal practice was endogamy. For Goth it was exogamy. In the case of both men and women, child marriage was the norm. For the majority of the people, monogamy was the norm, but among the elites, polygyny was in vogue. However, polyandry was not there. Marriage by this point of time was considered sacrosanct and indissoluble union. Therefore, divorce was not possible even in cases of cruelty. Women were often subjected to cruel treatment by their husbands, but they had no recourse in this. Further, the concept of bride price was no longer in vogue, right? So that had been replaced by the practice of dowry. ये हमको डेवलपमेंट्स देखने के लिए मिलते हैं. Now the institution of marriage was also responsible in some respects for the proliferation of castes. A number of jatis and sub-jatis began appearing, and contemporary literature talk about numerous such groups. These were supposed to be occupational groups, but they were also dependent on birth, marriage, region and occupation. Factors responsible for the proliferation of caste. This was a period of expanding agriculture, and new tribes were being incorporated into the Brahmanical society. After their assimilation, they were given a particular rank, and for this, new castes were invented. This phenomena was not limited to any particular region. It was a universal phenomena happening across North India. As a result, there were significant regional variations. Thirdly, caste was now performing the task that Varna was performing earlier. That means it had become the main medium for social ranking, because the Varna fourfold Varna system was no longer adequate. It did not have the same kind of refinement that caste had, and this was a period where it was becoming increasingly important for the elites to ensure that the entire surplus being produced at the lower levels of the economic pyramid was flowing towards the top. That is why Varna system was no longer adequate, and उसमें और ज़्यादा differentiation करने की जरूरत. the uh, you can say economic necessities were also being fulfilled with this institution of caste. Another factor that can be identified as being responsible for the proliferation of castes is the proliferation of land grants, right? A number of new groups associated with the practice of land grants. That means those groups who were playing an intermediary role now emerged, such as Kayasthas, who were the ones who were responsible for recording land grants. Okay? So these were the factors responsible for the proliferation of castes. Contemporary texts mention far more numerous castes as compared to earlier. Untouchability emerged as an important social evil during this period. It was already present, it continued to grow. The number of untouchables increased, the category of untouchables, categories of untouchables also increased, and their mistreatment and discrimination also increased. The factors responsible for this, first of all, the growing entrenchment of the notions of purity and pollution, which became associated with the occupation, right? Wherein, in the context of an increasingly ruralized society, craft groups began losing prominence and were thus ascribed the notion of being polluted. Okay? So, primarily the crafts groups were given the status of untouchable. Secondly, once again, untouchability was to a certain degree a practical necessity of the feudal socio economic order. Why? Because it is very important that the hierarchical structure of these systems be maintained. उसको dilute ना हो कर पाए. Right? Now, this hierarchy depends upon the so-called purity of Varnas, and therefore any violation of the Varna order resulted in untouchability. For example, a Brahmin woman gets married to a Shudra man, her offspring are automatically going to be consigned to the status of untouchables. Okay. Secondly, the society was also becoming localized. Localization of the economy was taking place. ये जो different groups हैं, craft groups, they represented a valuable pool of labor, right? If this pool of labor migrates from one region to another region, can it be replaced? नहीं हो सकता, because these occupations are also exclusive, they are linked with the caste status. Therefore, it is important to keep these people confined in their original areas. And one of the ways in which physical mobility was restricted was by reducing social mobility, by giving a lower rank within the society, so that the society as a whole becomes invested in keeping these people suppressed. Okay? That is another reason for the emergence of untouchability. In the field of religion, what do we see? Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and Jainism became quite popular, but Buddhism declined considerably. Bhakti and Tantricism continued as strong trends, but there was also revival of Vedic sacrifices. Rather than the word revival, because it had been reviving ever since the Gupta period, I should say further growth of Vedic sacrifices. And ultimately what happened to the temple cult? There was an assimilation of Vedic religion and Bhakti, and these temples and the new religious system came under the control of the Brahmins. So Brahminical culture and Brahminical religion, Brahminical ideology became more widespread. Education, what do we see? Continuation of earlier centers of learning such as Nalanda and Vikramshila. Some new centers of higher education also emerged, such as Ghar, Buddhist education or Buddhist learning declined, and on the other hand, education became deeply linked with the Brahmanical culture. Temples were receiving huge land grants, they were also maintaining their own schools and colleges. And Jainism. So, Brahmanism and Jainism were rising, therefore, education associated with these religions also increased. At the same time, the access to education became more restricted on the basis of Varna and gender. Further, due to the growing insularity of the society, avoidance of contact with the outside world, there was a distinct stagnation of science, learning, knowledge as a whole. Further, this stagnation was also being caused by the mixing of factual knowledge with fallacies. राइट तो किसी भी डिसिप्लिन में फॉर एग्जांपल साइंस है किसी भी तरह का for any phenomena that is being observed, some explanations are given, right? Now, generally, these explanations are the result of experimentation. A lot of data is collected, various other explanations are, observations are made, interpretations are made, right? तो उसके बाद कोई ना कोई explanation देते हैं, rules and theorems emerged after that. However, for at the same time, another process was happening that now the scientific knowledge was being given mythical explanations, right? And as a result, the sciences as a whole began to decline. Okay? At the same time, there was a deliberate attempt to stifle intellectual curiosity. Why was there a deliberate attempt to stifle intellectual curiosity? So that the people remain ignorant, and in their state of ignorance, they cannot challenge their social and ideological superiors. Okay? So, this was a natural outcome of the feudal society, which was characteristically closed, insular in nature. The stagnation of society of education can also be chalked up to its highly restrictive nature. As education was denied to larger and larger sections of the population, fresh ideas were not coming forward. Another reason for the stagnation of education was the increasing religious importance of education. Education was no longer seen as a practical approach to acquiring knowledge. It was now being seen as a religious pursuit, and thus the freedom of the scholars to challenge these now religious ideas that declined. Right? Education, scientific inquiry were sacrificed at the altar of faith. तो इन वजह से there was stagnation. क्लियर है? So ये हमको देखने के लिए मिलता है जनरल एस्पेक्ट ऑफ सोसाइटी ड्यूरिंग द राजपूत. नाउ लेट अस राइट ऑल ऑफ दिस वन बाय वन. लिखो. द राजपूत सोसाइटी, द राजपूत सोसाइटी was characterized by a rigid and hierarchical structure. Full stop. Subpoint. Differentiation was based upon the institutions of Varna, caste and gender. Varna, caste and gender. Full stop. Next subpoint. Varna and caste depended primarily upon birth. Next subpoint. The concept of purity and pollution. Became deeply entrenched and some groups were considered impure by birth. Next subpoint. There were rigid restrictions. On occupational freedom. Full stop. Only people belonging to a certain varna or caste were allowed to practice specific professions. ठीक है? Specific professions. Next subpoint. Varna, caste and gender emerged as the primary basis for social interaction. and regulated not only material life, मतलब economic life, ठीक है, associated with professions, not only material life but also social aspects such as marriage, interdining, access to education, and religious practices. Full stop. The society, next point, the society was sharply divided among the elites, made up of a Brahmin Kshatriya alliance, and the commoners who formed the bulk of the population, Next sub point लिखो. There was widespread inequality. And the socio-economic status of the elites was far superior to the commoners. ठीक है. Next main point. The socio-economic status of the Vaishyas was at par, AT space PAR, at par with the Shudras. Next sub point. This was due to the economic changes happening in the early medieval age. That's a point. With the decline of trade and crafts production, Vaishyas who were primarily associated with these activities experienced a loss of social rank. Next subpoint. On the other hand, comma, with the increasing importance of agriculture, comma, Shudras climbed the social ladder. Full stop. Next subpoint. Simultaneously, most Vaishyas also adopted agriculture as their primary occupation. Next subpoint. As such, in the practical and legal sense, comma, Vaishyas and Shudras were treated alike. Achha, who has made this historian? Which contemporary scholar? Al-Baruni ने observe किया है ये about Vaishyas and Shudras. ठीक है? So he makes some further observations that both of them lived in the same areas, had the same profession, cultivators थे ज़्यादातर. They did not have the right to receive education or recite the Vedas. ठीक है? So as compared to the upper varnas, Brahmins and Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas and Shudras occupied a lower position. That much is clear. Okay. Write down. Al-Baruni, next point. Al-Baruni observed that Vaishyas and Shudras lived and worked together full stop. They intermingled in their houses as well as in the open, and did not have the right to receive education. ठीक है? Next, number 3. The condition of women needs to be analyzed carefully. As contradictory information about their status appears during this time. Full stop. Subpoint. On one hand, it appears that their position improved. इसी सब पॉइंट के अंदर और सब पॉइंट्स ए बी सी करके लिख सकते हो। ए, देयर वाज नो पर्दा, देयर वाज नो पर्दा even among the elite women as observed by Al-Masudi. Al-Masudi was an Arab traveler who came to North India in the 10th century, and he says that the Rajput women appeared openly in the court of their husbands, their kings, right, without any veil. B, the right to own and inherit property was conferred, C-O-N-F-E-R-R-E-D, was conferred upon women by both the Mitakshara and Dayabhag, by both the Mitakshara and Dayabhag. C, the practice of Swayamvar, the practice of Swayamvar among Rajput women, allowed them to freely choose their husbands. D, contemporary literature mentions the presence of, contemporary literature mentions the presence of learned and highly cultured women in the Rajput courts, full stop. They were proficient in poetry, music, dance, painting, and even composed dramas and stories. ठीक है? Next main point. On the other hand, मतलब यही women के condition discuss कर रहे हैं उसके अंदर next point. On the other hand, it is generally accepted that women were considered subordinate to men. Next point. They were denied the right to education and were largely kept in seclusion. Next point. Apart from Mitakshara and Dayabhag, all the other contemporary legal texts prohibit women from inheriting property, prohibit women from inheriting property. Next subpoint. A general trend that can be observed is that the status of women became linked largely to their male relations. Became linked largely to their male relations, leading to loss of individuality. Full stop. Women were respected within the household as mothers and wives, due to their reproductive role. Full stop. However, in other respects, comma, the capabilities of women were largely ignored. Next subpoint. Were largely ignored. Next subpoint. Because of the practical necessity, of keeping women confined, comma, some negative stereotypes were attached to them. Full stop. Example, women were considered impure by nature. Full stop. Superstitions regarding menstruating women became popular. And they were considered an evil of the society. उस समय women were being put on the same level as gambling and drinking. ठीक है? The effect that gambling and drinking has on the society, women have the same impact. तो इसका मतलब क्या है? Keep women confined, उनकी बात ज्यादा मत सुनो, right? So these kinds of misconceptions, stereotypes were attached to women. Next subpoint. Further, women were also subjected to numerous evils such as child marriage, female infanticide, dowry, sati, jauhar, restrictions on widow remarriage, and denial of education and religious participation ठीक है, ये हो गया condition of women during the Rajput age. Next, number 4, marriage. 4 इसके पहले 3 ही डिस्कस किया ना? नहीं, वो 0.4 नहीं था, वो मैरिज में, वो विडो, सॉरी, कंडीशन ऑफ विमेन में ही कंटिन्यू हुई. नेक्स्ट, नंबर 4, मैरिज. लिखो. It was regulated by the institutions of Varna, caste and Gotra. Where the norms were endogamy in the case of Varna and caste and exogamy in the case of Gotra. Endogamy in the case of Varna and caste and exogamy in the case of Gotra. Next sub point. Child marriage was the norm. Child marriage was the norm. And pre-puberty marriage was encouraged, especially in the case of men or women? Women, especially in the case of women. Why was this done? Because of the importance of women in their reproductive role. Women had a very important role in the society. They were going to produce new workers, farmers, warriors, right? And therefore, it was an important economic resource to be controlled by the elites of the society. Now, they wanted that the women should not have any freedom of choice when it comes to her choice of marriage. Okay? And therefore, it was to be done on the basis of the ideological norms set by the elites. तो ये कब पॉसिबल होगा? When are women more liable to listen? जब बड़े हो जाएंगे या जब छोटे होंगे? छोटे होंगे, they do not have the freedom to exercise their choice. तब तक उतना conscience ही नहीं develop हुआ है, right? So child marriage was the norm, especially for women. Next point, next sub point, write down. Monogamy was the norm. However, among elites, polygyny was the normal practice. Contemporary literature mentions Rajput rulers having multiple wives. ठीक है? Clear? Next sub point. Because of the increasing importance of marriage, from the perspective of population growth, from the perspective of population growth, it was increasingly being recognized as a sacrament, as a sacrament. It was increasingly being recognized as a sacrament. Okay? Therefore, it was almost practically impossible. It was almost practically impossible to dissolve a union. To dissolve a union. Right? लेकिन यहाँ पे once again there is a little bit of complexity because contemporary जो text हैं, legal text है, they mention some cases in which divorce would be granted or in which a marriage would be dissolved. Write down. At the same time, comma, contemporary legal texts mention the conditions under which a marriage may be dissolved. A marriage may be dissolved. किस तरह के conditions? Cruelty by a partner, infertility of a partner, illness of a partner, or long-term absence of a partner may be valid grounds for the dissolution of marriage. तो ये चीजें कहाँ पे और मेंशन करी गई थी? In the Vedas, right? So it appears that in practice ये सब नहीं हो रहा था. It was not allowed. But in order to legitimize their authority as legal experts, the scholars were quoting directly from the Vedas. Vedas में ऐसा लिखा हुआ है, ठीक है? So write down. However, हाँ इसी में कर. However, most modern historians believe that contemporary legal experts were trying to enhance their legitimacy as an authoritative source. Enhance their legitimacy as an authoritative source by aligning their texts with the Vedas. ठीक है? Next point, next sub point. Another practice that became increasingly associated with marriage was that of dowry. Marriage was that of dowry. Paid by the woman's family to her husband. What kind of items were given as dowry? बताइए, अभी दहेज में क्या मिलता है? टीवी, फ्रिज, गाड़ी, घर, ये सब मिलता है। उस समय क्या मिलता था? Land was a very important item which was exchanged as dowry. Apart from this, cattle, horses, right? These kinds of things were exchanged. Then, if the family was wealthy, maybe some precious metals, jewelry, etc. But this jewelry was not given to the husband; it was given to their daughter, right? To take with her to her new home. Write down items such as land, cattle, horses, were gifted. Full stop. Jewelry was given to the woman. ठीक है? दोनों के बीच में डिफरेंस क्या होता था? The jewelry given to the woman at the time of her marriage was considered her स्त्री धन, ठीक है? And it could not be taken away from her. She could not be alienated from it. It was up to her to decide what to do with it. If she wanted, she could keep it. If she wanted, she could pawn it or even sell it away. वहाँ पे कोई और उसके साथ interfere नहीं कर सकता. At least this was what is mentioned in the contemporary legal texts. ठीक है? Write down. This constituted her स्त्री धन, over which she notionally exercised complete control. ठीक है? तो ये हो गया मैरिज. नंबर 5, proliferation of castes. लिखो. The proliferation of castes had been going on for a long period. हमने सबसे पहले इसको कब ऑब्जर्व किया था? In our study of history, proliferation of caste, emergence of the concept of caste, जाति, post modern period में ही इसको ऑब्जर्व कर लिया था, right? So it had been continuing from then only. What is the line that you have written? For a long period of time and accelerated during the Rajput age. Subpoint. Caste became an important social marker and was associated with birth, region, and occupation. Full stop. It also became an important regulatory factor in marriage. full stop. Next subpoint. The proliferation of castes was induced by several factors. Including A, B, C, D करके A, the peasantization of tribes due to expanding agriculture. B, economic necessities such as the need to ensure the upward flow of surplus in the backdrop of rising social complexity. Wherein the fourfold Varna system was proving inadequate to properly differentiate among social ranks. See, regional variations wherein the same process produced different castes in different regions. D, proliferation of land grants and emergence of groups such as Kayasthas in association with them. So, proliferation of castes was another important feature of the Rajput society. Next, right, untouchability. अच्छा नहीं, अभी अनटचेबिलिटी मत लिखो, इसके पहले कुछ एक आध पॉइंट्स और लिख लो, सम एविडेंस, राइट. So in the previous one, proliferation of caste, we continue writing next sub point. Contemporary literature mentions a large number of jatis. Example, Kalhana mentions 64 jatis, and the Brahma Vaivarta Puran mentions 100 mixed jatis. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट नंबर 6 या 7 जो भी है, 6 अनटचेबिलिटी। लिखो, द फर्स्ट मेंशन ऑफ अनटचेबिलिटी was made in Gupta era sources. Was made in Gupta era sources. Full stop. Faheen referred to which group of untouchables? Chandals. Faheen referred to Chandals as outcasts, whose touch or even sight was considered polluting. Full stop. Next sub point. By the Rajput age, the practice of untouchability became more widespread. And both the number and categories of untouchables increased considerably. Full stop. The level of social exclusion and exploitation also increased. Full stop. Next sub point. Al-Biruni mentions the presence of 8 Antyaj castes. 8 Antyaj castes. Antyaj castes who were inferior to the Shudras. And were they part of the Varna system or outside the Varna system? And were not part of the Varna system. Most of them were associated with a particular craft, which was considered impure. Such as some crafts which were considered impure during the period of Al-Biruni: pottery, tannery, carpentry, etc. Okay? So you can write to it. Pottery, tannery, carpentry, weaving, etc. Now, apart from these 8 Antyaj castes, Al-Biruni further mentions some other untouchable groups which were considered to be impure. Write down. Apart from these, next sub-point. Apart from these castes, or sorry, apart from these Antyaj castes, some other groups were also considered untouchable, such as Chandalas, Domas, Bhedas, Bhodatus, etc. Their professions were considered unclean. Their professions were considered unclean. And they were considered to be the illegitimate children of Shudra men and Brahmin women. Shudra men and Brahmin women. They were considered to be the illegitimate children of Shudra men and Brahmin women. ठीक है? तो वही जो पुराना आइडिया था, that of वर्ण समकार being responsible for the emergence of jatis, and the most undesirable ones, that means between Shudra man and Brahmin women, was resulting in the emergence of untouchable groups. ठीक है? Next point, right? Next sub point. The expansion of untouchability may be attributed to the increasing importance of the concepts of purity and pollution, and ascription of these attributes to various occupations. Next point. This was to various professions. Okay? This was the result of the practical necessities of the feudal socio-economic order which placed emphasis upon hierarchy and localism. क्लियर है? इसको और एक्सपैंड करना है, याद नहीं आएगा? नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. The feudal society depended upon the ranking of different groups and stability was contingent upon the separation of these ranks to maintain the integrity of the social order. Full stop. Thus, intermixing had to be prevented. कैसे प्रिवेंट किया जाएगा? Some groups were considered pure, others were considered impure. Some were considered superior, others were considered inferior. Contact, interdining, marriage, etc. were prohibited, restricted. Okay? With this, the notionally pure groups would always be in an ideologically superior position as compared to the lower group. This would allow them to convince the groups at the lower position to supply their entire surplus to the upper group. Okay? The ideas of loyalty, obedience, bhakti, surrender, etc. all coincided with the need to reinforce hierarchy. Clear? Next sub point likho. The localized feudal economy depended upon the services of distinct craft groups and could not afford to lose them due to emigration. Thus, stricter restrictions on physical and social mobility were needed. ठीक है? अभी समझ में आया है? Next, number 7, religion. The Rajput period was a golden age for the growth of Vaishnavism and Shaivism, which flourished due to A, B से करके लिखो. A, the proliferation of Puranic literature. B, the popularity of Bhakti, which was attractive for the general masses. C, the construction of monumental temples. D. Endowment of the priestly class and religious centers through land grants and cash rewards. By the Rajput kings. By the Rajput kings. ठीक है, ये हो गया फैक्टर्स फॉर द ग्रोथ ऑफ वैष्णविज्म एंड शैविज्म. नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. सिमिलरली Jainism also flourished, especially in Gujarat and Rajasthan, with a number of Jain temples being constructed by Rajput rulers. By Rajput rulers. Next sub point. At the same time, Buddhism experienced a decline in popularity. Due to a combination of factors. Such as A, B, C, A, the revival of Brahmanism through bhakti. B, Buddhism losing its distinct identity. To closely resemble ritualized Brahmanism. C, the loss of the reformative agenda of Buddhism. Right? So early Buddhism had emerged as a reform movement also, right? So that notion was now lost. It had become very much like pre-bhakti Brahmanism, an elite-led movement, a movement to fulfill the interests of the elite class. So that is why it lost popularity among the early adherents. The lower varnas, women, etc., they were no longer attracted. Next sub point. Patronage in Western India, in Rajasthan and Gujarat, दोनों को किया Vaishnavism, Shaivism as well as Jainism, and in the rest of India primarily Vaishnavism, and in the rest of North India primarily Vaishnavism and Shaivism. Now Buddhism did continue to flourish in Eastern India to some degree. Palas till the 10th century remained staunch supporters of Buddhism. नालंदा विक्रमशिला इसीलिए इस समय तक survive कर पाए. However, with the decline of the Palas, there was no longer any important patron for Buddhism also in North India. ठीक है, तो दैट इज वन इंपॉर्टेंट रीजन फॉर द डिक्लाइन ऑफ बुद्धिज्म ड्यूरिंग द राजपूत। लिखो डी, लॉस ऑफ रॉयल पेट्रनेज after the decline of the Palas, after the decline of the Palas, ठीक है, and E, the innovative approach of Brahmanism, the innovative approach of Brahmanism to assimilate different sects through the concept of, किस कॉन्सेप्ट के थ्रू असिमिलेशन किया इन्होंने, वैष्णविज्म और शैविज्म ने, अवतारवाद, इनकारनेशन। दैट मीन्स जो डिफरेंट सेक्ट्स के फॉलोअर्स थे, दे वर नाउ टोल्ड दैट योर गॉड इज एक्चुअली नॉट डिस्टिंक्ट फ्रॉम आवर गॉड, ही इज सिंपली एन इनकारनेशन ऑफ आवर गॉड, एन अवतार ऑफ आवर गॉड। फॉर एग्जाम्पल, वैष्णविज्म में हाउ मेनी अवतार्स ऑफ विष्णु, 10 अवतार्स, 10 अवतार ऑफ विष्णु, राइट। 9th अवतार कौन है, बलराम, right? And another alternate understanding is that Buddha is also the 9th avatar. So all the followers of Buddhism were automatically assimilated within Brahmanism, within Vaishnavism, right? So, and because by this point of time Buddhism had lost its distinct identity, its reformative agenda, लोगों को कोई फर्क भी नहीं पड़ा उस वजह से, ठीक है, nobody resisted again. So, what have you written last? Through the concept of reincarnation. Within brackets, you can write Avtarvad. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, सॉरी नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट जो भी है। The Rajput period witnessed the continued growth of Bhakti and Tantricism. Of Bhakti and Tantricism. क्यों ग्रोथ हो रहा था भक्ति और तांत्रिसिज्म का? We have already discussed this in the context of the post-Gupta period, 7th 8th century context में हम डिस्कस कर चुके, याद है वो फैक्टर्स? Expansion of agriculture, peasantization of tribes, the attempt made by Brahmanism to reform itself to address the challenge of other sects such as Buddhism, the necessity of the emerging feudal order, right, to maintain hierarchies, and the emergence of new myths, new ideas which led to the emergence of Tantra. तो उसके लिए you can simply go back to the previous discussion. तो लास्ट क्या लिखा है, भक्ति एंड तांत्रिसिज्म continue to grow, right? Next sub point, further the importance of Vedic sacrifices also increased. Why did it increase? Because of the support that Brahmins were receiving from the Rajput rulers. Rajput rulers के रूल को legitimize किसके थ्रू किया जा रहा था? Through these rituals only, through these Vedic sacrifices. ठीक है, write down. This was due to A, the role played by sacrifices in conferring political legitimacy upon the rulers. Political legitimacy upon the rulers. B, और क्यों, और क्या रीजन हो सकता है फॉर द रिवाइवल ऑफ sacrifices, for the growing importance of sacrifices? This was a period where expansion of agriculture was taking place, and expansion of agriculture के पीछे एक important phenomena responsible. What was that? Land grants. And who were most of these land grants being made to? Brahmin priests, right? Brahmin priests were being settled in the frontier areas. And frontier areas में कौन रह रहे थे? Tribals. As they were incorporated into the mainstream society, what was their first point of contact? The Brahmin priests. And Brahmin priests ने उनको किसका importance समझाया? These sacrifices. ठीक है? So that is why the importance of sacrifices became more important. लिखो. The expansion of agriculture through land grants played an important role in the spread of Brahmanical culture. In the spread of Brahmanical culture. ठीक है, और क्या फैक्टर रिस्पॉन्सिबल हो सकता है इसके लिए? फ्यूडलिज्म, राइट? कैसे? अब देखो, हमने कल डिस्कस किया था वेरियस कैटेगरीज ऑफ फ्यूडेटरीज, तो उसमें कौन कौन सी कैटेगरीज थी याद है? 4 तरह के फ्यूडेटरीज बताए थे. एक तो कि राजा किसी बंदे से खुश हुआ, उसको खूब सारा लैंड दे दिया, पावर दे दिया, राइट? अनदर कैटेगरी वेयर किसी रीजन में ड्यू टू इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ, ड्यू टू द करेक्ट मटेरियल एंड मिलिट्री कंडीशन, सम पावरफुल ग्रुप में emerge and the king has to confirm the feudal rights of those groups. For further some new territory is annexed, तो वहां के रूलर को अपना वैसल बना लिया गया. अलग अलग तरह से हो रहा था, राइट? अब इसका क्या एसोसिएशन है विद द ग्रोइंग इंपॉर्टेंस ऑफ वैदिक साइंस? ये जितने भी फ्यूडेटरीज हैं, which status or which identity, which group do they belong to? अपने आप को हमेशा क्या बोलते हैं? That we are Rajput, we are Kshatriya, right? तो कोई जरूरी है कि ये पैदा राजपूत या क्षत्रिय हुए? नहीं, हमने पहले भी देखा. हरमन कुलके ने क्या बोला है? प्रेजेंटाइजेशन ऑफ ट्राइब. एच.एन. सिन्हा ने क्या बोला है? सॉरी, हरमन कुलके ने बोला है द प्रोसेस ऑफ राजपुताइजेशन, सिन्हा क्षत्रियाइजेशन, राइट? तो ये क्षत्रियाइजेशन, राजपुताइजेशन अपने आप हो रहा था और somebody was doing it. Somebody was doing it. Brahmins were doing it through Vedic sacrifices. Through these Vedic sacrifices, not only were they conferring legitimacy upon the rulers, the kings, but also upon the feudatories or the subordinate rulers. Okay, write down. See, feudalism also played an important role also played an important role in the growing importance of Vedic sacrifices. As uh, they were crucial, as they were crucial for legitimizing the position of feudatories as Rajput or Kshatriya, as Rajput or Kshatriya. ठीक है? नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो और नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. During this period, another important phenomena was the incorporation of bhakti within the Vedic religion. Full stop. Through temples, both devotional bhakti as well as Vedic sacrifices were given the same importance. यानी कि दोनों का ही रिलीजियस एफिकेसी को इक्वेट कर दिया गया, राइट? फुल स्टॉप. As such, with the co-opting of bhakti, into Brahminism, the foundation for continued Brahmanical dominance was cemented. ठीक है? तो ये ट्रेंड देखने के लिए मिला है हमें रिलीजन में. नेक्स्ट नंबर 7, 8 एजुकेशन. लिखो. एजुकेशन continued to flourish in earlier centers such as Nalanda and Vikramshila, while new centers emerged such as Dhar and Abu. Next sub point. With the decline of Buddhism, education came to be closely associated with Brahminism and Jainism closely associated with Brahminism and Jainism. Full stop. Temples and mathas. Temples and mathas became the chief centers of learning. Became the chief centers of learning. ठीक है? Next point. Along with this, comma, the access to education became highly restricted. As the lower varnas and women were completely excluded. ठीक है? Next point. The Indian understanding of science, क्या? हाँ, ऑलमोस्ट सभी को यहाँ पे इन हायर एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूट में तो कोई जाते ही नहीं थे ना. अर्लियर दे यूज्ड टू विजिट प्लेसेस सच एज नालंदा. Some bhikkhunis were also receiving education in the Bihars, but with the decline of Buddhism, वो सब तो खत्म हो गया. Now Rajput women, the princesses, etc., if they were getting any education, they were getting it within the confines of the palaces. They were not going to these colleges. यहाँ colleges में कौन जा रहा था? Only the upper caste men, upper varna men. हाँ. Next, Indian understanding of science and general level of learning during the Rajput period was characterized by the element of stagnation. This was due to the following factors. A, B, C, D करके लिखो. A, the growing insularity of the Indian society. Wherein contact with outsiders was discouraged. And knowledge from external sources was discarded. Next sub point. B. There was a tendency to mix factual knowledge with myths and fantasies. Full stop. इसमें अल्बरूनी ने क्रिटिसाइज किया है इंडियन स्कॉलर्स को फॉर डूइंग दिस, गिविंग द सेम अमाउंट ऑफ इंपॉर्टेंस टू both factual explanations as well as mythical explanations for various phenomena. Al-Biruni criticizes Indian scholars in the same subpoint B में ही. Al-Biruni criticizes Indian scholars for giving the same importance to fact-based investigation and mythical explanation of phenomena of phenomena of phenomena. ठीक है. C, education was increasingly treated as a religious pursuit. Full stop. This discouraged the application of critical thinking as learning was transformed from a rational pursuit to a faith-based pursuit, or to a matter of faith. Faith-based pursuit से change कर दो to a matter of faith. From a rational pursuit to a matter of faith. ठीक है. Next कौन सा? D. C या D है? D. लिखो. The heavy restrictions on access to education. Resulted in the exclusion of potentially disruptive ideas, which are necessary for intellectual progress. Full stop. Therefore, education became a highly specialized elite activity with little scope for evolution. ठीक है. And E right. In response to the increasing feudalization of the society, intellectual curiosity was deliberately suppressed or deliberately discouraged in order to maintain in order to maintain a gap between the elites and the commoners. A gap between the elites and the commoners. Okay? These were the factors behind the stagnation of education. Take down a couple of questions. Analyze the essential features. Analyze the essential features of Rajput society with a special emphasis upon the condition of women. Upon the condition of women. Full stop. $200 words. अगला क्वेश्चन लिखो. How did the institution of feudalism shape the Rajput social structure? Rajput social structure and institution. Illustrate, full stop, illustrate by analyzing the educational system. The educational system. 200 words, 15 marks. हो जाएगा. यहाँ से अगर क्वेश्चन आएगा ना तो इसी तरह का आएगा. You will probably be asked to enlist the important characteristics of the Rajput society, or you will be asked to identify the impact of a particular phenomena and how it shaped the Rajput society, and उसके साथ साथ you will have to expand upon one particular aspect. Most questions are going to be of this type. अगला क्या देखना है हमको? The Rajput economy. What do we know about the Rajput economy? चीफ ऑक्यूपेशन क्या था इस समय लोगों का? एग्रीकल्चर. What was the chief source of state income? Land revenue. A variety of fees. For the use of important infrastructure such as irrigation works, etc. A large variety of fines for violation of some important regulations, etc. It was the revenue system characterized by the element of centralization or decentralization? Decentralization. Why was this? This was due to the growth of the feudalism, the nature of the feudal economy, self-sufficient and localized. Does this mean that no trade happened? Some trade did happen. Why was this? Because क्यों हो रहा था ये? एक तो because of ecological and regional variation. It was not possible to produce all the locally needed goods in each of these regions. Therefore, some contact was necessary. Secondly, और क्यों जरूरी था? Why was some trade necessary? Because in order to sustain the state system which was emerging, the absence of trade could not have been sufficient. Some amount of trade was needed by the royals, the kings, to run their administration, supply their military, etc. Okay? So, to fulfill the state demand, some amount of trade was necessary as well. Third, this was a period where temple construction was increasing. Temples were consuming a large variety of goods and not all goods were locally available. Right? Now, if trade was happening, then some goods must be also being produced. तो बताओ क्राफ्ट प्रोडक्शन था या नहीं था? हाँ. दो कैटेगरीज, हैंडीक्राफ्ट्स फॉर local consumption and goods produced for trade. Right? Now, handicrafts for local consumption would include things such as pottery, utensils of different kinds, agricultural tools of different kinds, etc. Right? Goods produced for trade would include things such as textiles, luxury items, such as ivory works, silks, embroidered cloth, etc., or perfumes, right? Or oils, maybe even some uh, textiles, luxury items, oils, and processed foods such as jaggery, etc., right? तो ये अलग अलग तरह का क्राफ्ट प्रोडक्शन यहाँ पर चल रहा है. Now the economic relationship between the state and temples becomes very important to understand. Temples received large endowments from the state in the form of land grants and cash money, right? Because of this, what happened? The state was alienated from an important source of wealth as the temples enjoyed tax exemptions. ठीक है? Now, unlike temples in South India at the same time, the North Indian temples were not investing their accumulated wealth into the economy. They were not using it to fund trade or crafts production, क्योंकि ये activities अभी उतनी develop हुई नहीं थी North India. So North Indian temples were largely hoarding their wealth. They were not churning it back into the economy. इसकी वजह से हुआ क्या? While the temples emerged as large sinks of wealth, the economy suffered from lack of sufficient resources. Monetization होना वापस शुरू हो गया था, but had the temples invested their accumulated wealth, it would have happened at a much larger pace, right? So it resulted in subdued secondary economic activities. And since the secondary economy was in a subdued state, the state was also deprived of valuable taxes, valuable revenues. So state income also suffered. So it was suffering both because of the loss of land revenue as well as commercial revenue. Clear? As such, the state faced a resource crunch, due to which administration suffered, due to which feudalism increased, since the state was not in a position to pay its official in the form of cash salaries. They were forced to pay the official in the form of land grants, and due to which there was frequent warfare, which further contributed to the resource crunch that the state was facing. And because of the financial strain that the state was under, the military preparedness and strength of the state was quite poor. ठीक है? तो एक यूनिक सिचुएशन इमर्ज हुआ है that on the one hand temples have emerged as extremely wealthy institutions who are storing most of their wealth in their own basements, whereas on the other hand the state, which is supposed to defend the temples against any attacks from outside, that is not in a position to do so. So for the Turkish invaders, these temples are going to appear as juicy, easily attainable targets. And this explains why from the 10th century onwards there were repeated invasions of temples in North India by Mahmud of Ghazni. Same happened 150 years later under Muhammad Ghori. ठीक है? तो ये है the nature of the Rajput economy. Right? अब इसको हम कल लिख लेंगे. ठीक है? I'm ending the class for now. Online students, any doubts?